The iron beast let out a mournful whistle as it pulled into Bitter Creek Station, black smoke billowing into the gray Montana sky. The year was 1882, and winter had sunk its claws deep into the land. Snow fell in fine, wind-driven sheets, coating the platform in white that crunched under Jacob Harland's boots. He tugged his coat collar higher and squinted through the flurry at the passengers stepping down. He hadn't wanted to come. 2 hours on horseback through frozen country just to fetch another man's bride. But Ethan McCready was like a brother to him, had been ever since the war. When Ethan begged, saying the mayor's daughter was visiting and he couldn't leave town, Jacob agreed to meet the Boston lady who was to be Ethan's mail-order bride. Ethan had talked about her for months, Miss Marianne Whitfield. Pretty, 20 years old, golden curls and blue eyes. He'd shown her photograph to anyone who'd look. Ethan said she'd be the kind of woman to make the long winters softer. Now Jacob stood, watching families reunite, businessmen rush into the warmth, and miners tramp away into the snow. He searched for golden curls among the crowd. Instead, he saw a woman step down from the third-class car. Plain brown dress, patched at the elbows, hair pulled tight in a bun streaked with gray. She was older than Ethan's 20-year dream. 30, maybe more. There were lines at her mouth, weariness in her shoulders. Yet there was also a quiet dignity, a stillness that didn't match the chaos of the platform. She carried a single carpet bag, its handle frayed, and stood looking around, eyes full of uncertainty. For a heartbeat, their gazes met. Her eyes were gray, flecked with blue, and something in them, loneliness, maybe hope, made Jacob's chest tighten. Then she looked away. He waited, thinking the real bride would appear behind her. But when the last passenger left and the station master shouted for the train to pull out, she was still there, shivering in a thin shawl. Jacob sighed and approached. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat. "Are you waiting for someone?" Quote. She turned, her voice soft, touched with Eastern polish. "Yes, Mr. Ethan McCready. He was to meet me." Jacob's gut twisted. "You're Miss Whitfield?" Color rose in her cheeks. "Eleanor Whitfield," she said quietly. "Marianne's sister." For a moment he could only stare. "Where's Marianne?" Eleanor clutched her bag tighter. "She couldn't come. I came in her place." "In her place?" His voice came out harsher than intended. Ethan paid passage for. "I know." Her tone stayed calm, but he saw her throat move as she swallowed. "I can explain, if you'll allow me. Is Mr. McCready here?" Jacob removed his hat, rubbing the back of his neck. "No, ma'am. He sent me." "I'm Jacob Harland, his friend." "Then perhaps you'll take me to him," she said simply. "I've come a very long way." Snow whipped across the platform, stinging his face. She was trembling now, lips nearly blue. Whatever her story, she'd freeze if she stayed much longer. Jacob picked up her bag. "My wagon's this way." Their fingers brushed as she let him take it, her hand icy cold. He helped her up, handed her a blanket. "Thank you," she murmured, wrapping it around herself. They rode through miles of white silence. The wind hissed through bare cottonwoods. The horses' breath came in clouds. Jacob stole glances at her, the set of her jaw, the calm in her eyes despite exhaustion. There was strength there, and pride. "Mr. Harland," she said after a long silence, "I suppose you'd like to know why I'm here. That's between you and Ethan. Still, you've been kind enough to come for me. You deserve to know." She took a slow breath. "Marianne is 18. Beautiful. She began corresponding with Mr. McCready after seeing his advertisement. Our father had just died. We had debts, no money, no home. She thought marriage to a rancher sounded like an adventure." Eleanor's voice trembled slightly as she went on. 2 weeks before she was to leave, she met someone, a young clerk at the bank. They fell in love. She came to me in tears, saying she couldn't marry a man she didn't love. She begged me to help her. Jacob's hands tightened on the reins. "So you came instead." I couldn't let her throw away her happiness, and I had nothing to stay for. She gave a faint, self-mocking smile. "I'm 32, Mr. Harland. Well past the age when women dream of love letters and courtship, I thought perhaps Mr. McCready might accept me instead. I can work, keep house, do all the things a frontier wife must do." Jacob didn't answer. He understood desperation. He'd seen it in men's eyes during the war, in settlers who'd lost everything to drought or debt. "Ethan's expecting Mary Ann," he said finally. "He's been showing her picture to everyone for months." "I know," she said softly. "I hoped he might look beyond that." Snow thickened, turning the world into a blur of gray and white. When they topped the final ridge, Ethan's ranch lay below, dark house, smoke rising from the chimney. Eleanor sat straighter. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Harland." Jacob glanced at her, then down at the house, already imagining Ethan's face when he saw her instead of his golden dream. "Whatever happens," he said, voice low, "you were brave to come all this way." Eleanor's eyes met his. "Thank you," she said simply. The horses stopped at the porch. Ethan burst out, grinning wide, until his eyes landed on the woman Jacob helped down. His smile froze. "Where's Mary Ann?" he demanded. "I'm Eleanor Whitfield," she said. "Mary Ann's sister. She couldn't come. I didn't pay for Mary Ann's sister," Ethan snapped, stepping closer. "I paid for Mary Ann. Young, pretty Mary Ann. Not—" His gaze swept over her cruelly. "Not some worn-out spinster." Jacob's jaw tightened. "Ethan." "Stay out of this, Jake." Ethan's voice rose. "Where is she? Did she send you to beg for more money?" Quote, "She's married," Eleanor said quietly. "I came in her place. I can do everything she promised." Ethan laughed sharply. "You think I wanted a cook? I can hire a cook. I wanted a wife, someone young enough to give me sons." By now, ranch hands had gathered, drawn by the commotion. Some smirked, others looked away in shame. Eleanor stood straight, eyes calm, though her hands trembled. "I've traveled 2,000 miles. I have nowhere else to go, if you'll just give me a chance." "A chance?" Ethan barked. "You think I'll let the town laugh at me for ending up with your dried-up old sister?" Quote. That broke something in Jacob. "That's enough." "Is it?" Ethan sneered. "You'd take her then?" Jacob looked at the woman standing alone in the snow, shawl thin as paper, pride, the only thing keeping her upright. He heard himself say, "She can stay at my place." The crowd fell silent. Ethan stared. "Your place?" "I've got an empty cabin. She'll stay there till she figures out what to do next." "You're a fool," Ethan spat. "Don't expect me to pay for her keep. I'm not expecting anything." Jacob picked up Eleanor's bag. "Ma'am, if you'll get back in the wagon." She hesitated, then nodded. Her voice was small but steady. "Thank you, Mr. Harland." As the wagon rolled away, laughter followed them on the cold wind. But Jacob didn't look back. He'd seen enough cruelty for one lifetime. And as he glanced at Eleanor beside him, her face pale, eyes full of tears she refused to shed, he knew one thing for certain. Whatever storm was coming, he wasn't about to let the world break her again. Dawn came slow over the Montana plains, the light soft and cold as it crept across Jacob Harland's ranch. The fire in the small cabin crackled weakly, throwing flickers of warmth against the log walls. Eleanor Whitfield stood by the stove, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. She had barely slept. Every creak of the cabin had sounded like judgment, every gust of wind outside like laughter from that hateful crowd. Jacob had given her the cabin, a blanket, and silence. The man hadn't said 10 words on the ride home, but his kindness had spoken louder than any of Ethan's boasts ever had. He'd even left a loaf of bread and a jar of honey on the table before leaving her alone to rest. Now, in the early light, she looked at her reflection in the small, cracked mirror above the wash basin. The face that looked back wasn't the one she remembered from Boston. It was older, thinner, but the eyes, they were still her own. Determined, if tired. She set her jaw. "You'll earn your keep, Eleanor Whitfield," she whispered. "One way or another." Outside, Jacob's voice carried from the main yard, giving orders to his ranch hands. She stepped to the window and saw him, tall, broad-shouldered, his coat dusted with frost, his dark hair glinting in the early sun. He moved like a man who'd spent his life fighting this land and learning to respect it. When she finally stepped outside, the air bit hard at her face. Jacob looked up from the corral, surprise flickering in his eyes. "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep," she said simply. "I'd like to help if you'll let me." He frowned slightly. "You don't have to. You're a guest here." "I'm not used to being anyone's guest," she said softly. "I can cook, sew, mend, whatever needs doing. I won't take charity, Mr. Harland." Jacob studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Cookhouse could use another pair of hands. Cookie's half blind and meaner than a mule, but he'll show you what's needed." Quote. That day, Eleanor threw herself into the work. She peeled potatoes, scrubbed pans, and helped serve the men when they came in from the cold. The ranch hands were rough men, some polite, others not. Most avoided her, whispering when they thought she couldn't hear. At the far end of the table, Tom Hadley smirked as she passed him the bread. "Didn't know we were running a charity home, boss," he said loudly. "Thought this was a cattle ranch, not a place for stray cats." The men chuckled. Eleanor froze, the plate trembling in her hands. Jacob's voice cut through the laughter. "That's enough, Tom." "Just saying, boss," Tom muttered, though the grin never left his face. Eleanor forced herself to keep moving, though her stomach twisted. She'd endured worse than whispers. Still, when she stepped out into the crisp air after breakfast, tears burned behind her eyes. Jacob found her by the well, scrubbing dishes. "You don't have to take that," he said quietly. "I've taken worse," she replied without looking up. "Words can't hurt half as much as hunger." Jacob was silent for a moment. "You handle yourself better than most men I know." She smiled faintly. "That's because I've had to." Days passed, and slowly the rhythm of ranch life became her own. She woke before dawn, helped Cookie with breakfast, mended clothes in the afternoons, and read by lamplight at night. The men grew used to her presence. Even the jokes began to fade. Jacob watched her more than he meant to. He noticed the way she hummed softly when she worked, the way she brushed a stray curl from her forehead with the back of her hand. He noticed how she never complained, never spoke of her own pain, and each day he found it harder to look away. One evening, he returned from checking the herd to find his coat hanging on the porch, mended neatly where it had torn weeks ago. The stitches were small and perfect. Beneath it, on the step, was a loaf of fresh bread wrapped in cloth. He knocked on her cabin door. She opened it, hair loose from its usual bun, eyes soft in the lamplight. "You didn't have to do this," he said, holding up the bread. "You didn't have to give me shelter," she answered. He hesitated. "You're making the men look lazy." A faint smile tugged at her lips. "Then perhaps they'll work harder." That smile stayed with him long after he walked back to the main house. But not everyone was willing to let her be. Tom Hadley, still nursing resentment, waited for a moment when Jacob wasn't around. It came one afternoon by the well. Eleanor was drawing water when Tom stepped too close. "You know," he said, his voice low and slick, "men talk. They say you came here looking for a husband. That true?" She kept her eyes on the bucket. "I came here to survive." Tom leaned in, his breath reeking of whiskey. "A woman your age ought to be grateful for attention, even if it comes from a cowhand instead of a ranch owner." "Step back, Mr. Hadley," she said calmly, though her pulse quickened. He laughed. "Or what? You'll tell your savior, Jacob? Man's too soft-hearted to toss you out, but I could be more accommodating." Before Eleanor could answer, a voice like thunder broke through. "Tom." Jacob's shadow fell across the ground behind him. Tom straightened quickly, color draining from his face. "Boss, I was just—" "You've got an hour to pack," Jacob said evenly. "Red'll have your pay ready." Tom's jaw dropped. "You're firing me? Over her?" Jacob stepped closer, his voice cold. "Over your mouth." "Now get." Tom's glare flicked from Jacob to Eleanor, then back. "You'll regret this," he spat before storming off toward the bunkhouse. Eleanor stood frozen. "You didn't have to do that," she said when Tom was gone. "I've dealt with men like him before." "Not on my land," Jacob said firmly. Not under my roof. Something flickered in her eyes. Gratitude, maybe something deeper. Your protection, she said softly. Is that what I'm under? He met her gaze. Yes, for as long as you need it. That night, snow fell quietly over the ranch, blanketing the world in white silence. Jacob stood on his porch, watching the light glow from her cabin window, and knew he was in trouble. He'd promised himself years ago never to let another woman close. But Eleanor Whitfield, the wrong sister, the woman no one wanted, was slowly undoing every wall he'd built. And somewhere between that snowy train station and this quiet night, Jacob Harland had fallen for her. Spring came slow to Montana that year. The snow melted in hesitant streams, filling the low gullies and turning the ranch roads to mud. The grass, tired from too many winters, fought to return in stubborn patches of green. And with the thaw came the whispers that reached all the way from town to Jacob Harland's doorstep. It started when Ethan McCready rode up one bright morning, hat low, temper high. He hadn't seen Jacob since that day at the station. Word was, he'd been drinking more than usual, trying to drown the embarrassment of being left for another man's charity. Jacob stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. Ethan dismounted, boots sinking in the damp earth. You've been busy, Jake, he said. Keeping my bride warm, I hear. Jacob's jaw tightened. She's not your bride. You made that clear. Ethan's eyes narrowed. I told you to stay out of it. Now folks in town say she's living under your roof. You think that don't make us both look foolish? Jacob's voice stayed calm. She's in the guest cabin. She works hard and asks for nothing. If that makes you look foolish, that's on you. Ethan took a slow step closer. You always did have a hero streak. I reckon it's not her work you're admiring. Before Jacob could answer, the cabin door opened. Eleanor stepped out, sunlight touching her hair, her hands dusted with flour. She froze at the sight of Ethan. Miss Whitfield, Ethan said sharply, you're a bold woman, taking what wasn't yours. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. I took nothing, Mr. McCready. You sent for a wife, not a photograph. If you wanted a child, you should have said so. Ethan's face flushed crimson. You lied to me. I came to save my sister, she said quietly. And I would do it again. Jacob stepped between them. You've said enough, Ethan. Quote. For a tense moment, the two men stared at each other, the silence thick. The years of friendship between them stretched thin as barbed wire. Then Ethan spat into the dirt, swung into his saddle, and rode off without another word. Eleanor stood there, her face pale but calm. He won't forgive that, she said softly. Jacob looked toward the road where Ethan had vanished. I don't need his forgiveness. From that day on, the ranch became quieter but heavier. The men worked without complaint, the cattle grazed, and the wind carried only the sounds of early spring. But something between Jacob and Eleanor had changed. The unspoken had grown louder. One afternoon she came to the corral with a basket of bread. Jacob was fixing a broken fence post. She handed him the loaf without a word. He wiped the sweat from his brow. You don't have to keep feeding me, you know. It's the least I can do, she said softly. You've given me a place in this world. Jacob leaned on the fence, studying her face. You don't owe me anything. Eleanor looked up at him, her gray eyes steady. That's where you're wrong, Mr. Harland. I owe you peace. You gave me that when you didn't have to. He felt the air shift between them, heavy with something neither dared name. Then she smiled faintly and turned toward the house. That night, the rain came. A storm rolled over the plains, fierce and sudden. Jacob was in the barn, securing the doors when a scream cut through the wind. He dropped his tools and ran. Eleanor's cabin door was open, the lantern inside flickering wildly. Lightning had struck the hill, setting dry grass ablaze and sending sparks toward the cabin. Eleanor, Jacob shouted, bursting through the doorway. She was trying to gather her few belongings, her mother's Bible, a letter, the small carpet bag she'd brought from Boston. Leave it, he shouted, grabbing her arm. I can't lose this. Everything else can burn. He pulled her out just as the flames caught the porch rail. The wind howled, pushing the fire closer. Jacob threw a blanket over her and led her toward the barn where the rain finally began to fall hard, hissing against the flames. They stood there, drenched, the orange glow reflecting in their eyes. The cabin, her home, collapsed with a groan, sparks shooting into the night sky. When it was over, Jacob turned to her. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "You've lost everything again." Eleanor shook her head, water dripping from her hair. "Not everything." He frowned. "What do you mean?" She met his eyes, voice trembling but sure. "I still have what matters." Jacob stared at her for a long moment, then reached out and brushed a wet strand of hair from her cheek. "You sure about that?" "I'm sure," she whispered. The world fell silent around them except for the soft patter of rain. Jacob's hand stayed on her cheek, his thumb tracing the edge of her jaw. For a man who'd spent years building walls, the moment felt like surrender. He leaned in, his forehead resting gently against hers. "You deserve better than this place," he murmured. She smiled through the tears. "Maybe. But I think this place finally gave me something worth staying for." When morning came, smoke still curled from the ashes of the cabin. Jacob stood beside Eleanor, the two of them wrapped in silence. "What will you do now?" he asked quietly. She looked toward the horizon, where the land stretched wide and endless. "I'll rebuild, if you'll let me." He smiled, small but real. "I was hoping you'd say that." Weeks later, a new cabin stood on the ridge, smaller but stronger than before. The men teased Jacob about the way he smiled now, about how the ranch seemed lighter, about the way Eleanor's laughter carried across the yard. Even Ethan came by once, hat in hand, to offer a quiet apology. Jacob didn't hold it against him. Some men needed to lose something good before they could see its worth. That summer, wildflowers bloomed where the ashes had been. And every morning, when Jacob stepped out to start his day, he found Eleanor on the porch, waiting with 2 cups of coffee and that calm, steady smile. In the end, he hadn't gone to fetch his friend's bride. He'd gone to find the woman who would finally bring warmth back into his life. The wrong sister, maybe, but the right heart. And in the quiet of that Montana dawn, Jacob Harland realized the truth every rancher learns sooner or later. Sometimes, what's meant for another man finds its way home to you anyway.